title of this video is Literature Gap. What do we mean by a gap in the literature? Well, we get into that in a lot of detail, but this is where you're going to make a unique and novel contribution. The reason I say ask somebody as the first slide, because there are people out there who already know where their gaps are, and there are, and always will be, a lot of gaps in your knowledge because there's just so much to read. Assume that only you see part of the picture and that other people see other parts that are necessary for you to progress your work. If you're having difficulties, you should ask someone. Now, there are several people that you need to ask. If you're just looking for a gap in the research or an overview of the research, ring a professor. How outrageous. You'll be really surprised if you pay for a cup of coffee how many hundreds of hours of reading it might save you to actually try and figure out what they can tell you. If you need to design an experiment, have a talk to a statistician. If you need to find literature online, have a chat to a librarian. They know what databases are appropriate. There are lots of different areas of expertise, and you don't, and I don't, have to know them all. Knowing who to ask and actually picking up the phone is important. Do not forget this. So let's say you are going to look for the information yourself just by searching through the literature. Well, the good news is that many people have already combed through the literature. There are literally hundreds of systematic literature reviews out there. Do a search in Google and other databases looking for literature reviews in your areas. If you can't find a literature review, find a whole bunch of related papers, follow through the references and find other related papers that seem interesting, and only look at the future work section, because that tells you what hasn't been done. It tells you where the gaps are. You're jumping straight to the back of the paper. You may not even read the abstract. If you're looking for the gaps, go hard at the future work. You may also see that in the introductions to papers, there are lists of advantages and disadvantages of other areas and categories. You can find gaps in there also. Just remember, a problem shared is a problem halved. If you don't take the problem on yourself and you realize that other people have approached the problem, then you can make great strides in finding a gap. It's not really your problem to solve. Everybody is interested in finding the gaps. So please take the time to take advantage of the work that's already being done rather than doing it entirely yourself. I'm now going to talk about how to do a systematic literature review. I'm now going to talk about how to do a systematic literature review where you're just looking at the papers yourself. A systematic review takes a body of work. It's looking at a lot of individual papers, putting them all together, trying to compensate by the fallibility of the papers. Now, any individual study, any engineering paper may be fallible in one way or another. It always has a scope and a context, a problem it's trying to solve. There are millions of scopes and contexts that it won't solve. Generally speaking, a paper solves one problem, and there may be many problems that the approach may be applicable for. A systematic review provides a really comprehensive picture of the state of the art. The one we saw earlier had around 200 papers in it. People have gone to the effort of doing an enormous amount of reading and trying to put together useful categories for you to find those gaps. The task of doing this is really quite extraordinary. I would not attempt this in a 6-week class. Findings from reviews provide context for interpreting a primary study. Any piece of work in that field can be related back to the systematic review in theory because it's so broad. Undertaking a new primary study without having an idea of the big picture may result in work that's unnecessary and isn't going to get published for several reasons. So how do you look at a paper and find the gap? There are a couple of key words to keep in mind. Probably the most common way is to use and identify quasi-negative subjects. As I've already said, having that negative Nelly mindset will help you to find those gaps, but there are some words that really give a great flavour, and you can hone in on those words and identify the gaps very quickly. Little is one, few is another, however is one. However, little and few. Few investigators, few researchers, little work, little research. There's words that just should flash out at you like an absolute beacon to show you that's where the paper thinks the gap is. Now the paper will contribute to the gap, but how much does it contribute to the gap? Does it actually close the gap entirely, or is there still room for you to make a contribution? Let's have a look at how many literature reviews have been done. Well, we've got the number of reviews on the left. You can see some areas have more reviews than others. In engineering, there's over 200, so you should be able to find some that are relevant for your specific discipline. In engineering and education, there's not very much at all, but other areas have much more. So if you're venturing into another area and you're going to be working with someone from that area, it does pay to take the time to familiarise yourself with that area to some extent, just so you don't come off as somebody that only focuses on the engineering. Like there are specific curves for these areas, there are also specialised databases for searching. Let's have a look at some of these. Well, for engineering, you can see a couple of them there. Compendex, InSpec, General Databases, Scopus, JSTOR, Journal Databases. There's quite a lot there. The Directory of Open Access Journals is a good one. And then there's a whole lot of other databases that you can look at. This is where you need to speak to a librarian. They understand what databases are useful for what disciplines, and if you're applying engineering into another domain, they can point you in the right direction where you can find those literature reviews to really set you on the right path. As I said, you need to know how to cite. The author has published a number of papers. It's been cited a number of times in a journal with a particular impact factor. Pay real attention to these numbers. Now, these numbers don't turn up in the papers, but you have to get to know what they are because they give you such a good idea about the credibility of the information, the credibility of the author, whether it's worth looking up that author and seeing whether there's something else they might have written that can really help you. Is it worth going to that effort? That's what these numbers can help you with. Again, it's about who to ask. Who are you going to pick up the phone and talk to? There's 100 papers out there. You don't want to make more than 3 phone calls. Who's it going to be? Use this data to help you make your decision and then go for it. Now, dimensions really matter when you're trying to classify things. Say you're looking at the literature and you're trying to put together categories of things. Well, if you just pick a few categories like a 4-legged group, that is really quite broad, as you can see from those examples there. And if you pick something like weight, it might select on lead versus gold, but they may not be the dimensions that you're actually interested in. It might be value. So think very carefully about the dimensions that you're using for classification. And this is where looking at literature reviews can help, because it shows you what dimensions are of interest to other people in the field. Let's look at classification. Now, taking a lot of information and breaking it down into its pieces in a similar way that we've done with the abstract has a number of advantages. It's definitive and it creates a reduction in complexity. If you can see an abstract in terms of the various pieces of information, it means you can read it much faster because you know what's coming. A category allows you to identify similarities. So you can look at a field and say, well, this field are using these particular moves. And you can look at other fields and say where they're different. It allows you to do comparison, and it lets you study relationships between things because you have a frame of reference that looks at certain attributes and relates them together. Now, classification is not all about advantages. You have to realise that classification does have several disadvantages. First, classification is descriptive. It's a way of looking at information. It doesn't explain necessarily why the information is the way it is. Second, it doesn't actually exist. It's a way of thinking about things. It's a way of structuring things, of putting something in boxes. It doesn't actually exist like that in the world. Next, it's static. Once you have those boxes, you may be tempted to fit the world into those boxes some of those boxes might need to be stretched. They may eventually break. That's the disadvantage of classification. It forces you to see the world in a particular way. It has advantages, but not all the time, if the types of things that are in those boxes change. Also, there's no magic formula for selecting the correct variables. You have to make decisions here. Nothing is going to tell you what those categories should look like. Now, you can look at a literature review, a systematic review, and choose those sorts of categories, but you're making decisions. Nothing's going to tell you what category you need to use. And finally, large categories are really hard to handle. You need to keep them small, you need to keep them compact. A classic example is the matrix. You have 2 dimensions, similar to before, where we looked at years versus applications and methods. Just keep it simple. The example that we've got here is researcher and student versus product-oriented versus service-oriented spin-offs. Once you've thought about the information and seen that it can be categorized in that way, it then allows you to just jam everything into a box. Is that the best way of thinking about the world? Well, if you've managed to get the same number of things into the box, then you've probably done a reasonably good job. If one box is empty though, you haven't. But if one box is nearly empty, it may mean that there's a gap there that you can take advantage of. So do try and think about the world in matrices. It provides a way of representing